Um, I appreciate all y'all being here. I would like you, most of y'all remember Marie, who was kind enough to video all of the ones last year. Her brother Thomas is here, and my daughter Sandy, their mama, is here also. I've been looking forward to this. I have to be honest about a couple of things. One, ALS is progressing, and I don't know how long I will be able to do these things. I hope I can get through the 8 sessions that we have allotted for the presidents, if we can, and if you all are wanting to go. And normally we would stop and wait until January, but if you all enjoy, we can just keep going for as long as I can go, and cover as much as we can. Um, if you notice a lot of moving around, it's my intention or my attempt to find something comfortable in this chair. I struggle with the wheelchair version of bed sores, and it makes it very difficult to find something that's comfortable all the time. So bear with me. I'm not, well, I was going to say I'm not crazy. I am crazy, but there's a reason for doing what I do. We brought in, I think, last week. Marie was kind enough to make copies of the order of worship, if you like. We are out, but I will bring some more next week, if there are those of you that did not get them and want. Basically, we're going to start with Washington and go all the way through Mr. Trump. So it's just a matter of how many we can get in any one time period. One last thing. I appreciate you all being here, but these things are more important to me than they are to you. Makes me feel like I'm still worth something. Sometimes I'm not sure of that. So here we go. American president. It's not a guarantee when the Constitution was made that we would have a president of the United States. The Articles of Confederation did have a commanding officer. They just kind of rotated who would be the executive among the 13 states, and everybody took it when it was their turn. Alexander Hamilton, one of the most important of the early American political leaders, made a 5-hour speech to the Constitutional Convention in which he advocated a king. Hamilton was very upfront that he believed that the British government was the finest government on the face of the earth, and that if America was going to make it, it was going to make it as a monarchy rather than as a republic. The truth is, not many republics in history of larger than, say, Athens and the surrounding territory had been successful. There was a sense that if America grew to what we were given at the Treaty of Paris, then there'd be no way for a Republican government to take charge of it. But despite all of that, the people in the Constitutional Convention, after working all through the summer of 1787, eventually came up with our governmental form today: a 2-house legislature, a court system that hadn't existed before, and then a chief executive officer, the President of the United States. Now, to a large degree, everybody knew that if we were going to have a president, who the president was going to be. That wasn't even questioned. That George Washington, the greatest of all Americans of his day, would be the president of the United States. And consequently, because people trusted Washington, they were willing to give the president perhaps more authority than they might have given otherwise, knowing that he was not going to abuse it. The other end of the spectrum, Washington didn't want the job. Washington, perhaps more than most people, was very concerned about reputation. And George Washington knew that he was the most popular man in America. And he was afraid that anything he did beyond being the commander during the Revolution would only serve to bring his reputation down. He turned down an opportunity to come to the Constitutional Convention until Madison got on his case and said, you got to go, you got no choice. You're worried about participating in the convention, bringing your reputation down. Trust me, if you don't go, it's going to bring your reputation way down. And so Washington not only came, he was the presiding officer. When it came time to run for office, again, Washington didn't want it. He felt like, given the nature of politics, that anything he did would serve to tarnish his reputation. But eventually, again, people like Madison and others got on his case and said, you got to do it. You're the one person that can make the system work. And if we were to look at George Washington, president, contribution to the United States, it's just that. He made it work. When it didn't exist, he came in and put some kind of meat on what was the bare bones of the Constitution. And he did it despite the fact that he didn't want to do it. He would much rather have gone back to Mount Vernon and spent the rest of his life working in his fields. He faced a number of issues. If you look at historians' ranking of the presidents, now again, recent presidents can't be ranked. Who knows what either the Bushes, Clinton, Trump, nobody, until we get some kind of time away from them, we don't know whether they'll be considered great presidents or poor presidents. But of those that are ranked, and generally you see rankings up through Eisenhower or maybe Kennedy, the top three are always the same. It's in some order: Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And the reason for that is those three guys carried America through the greatest crisis that we had to face. Washington was the crisis of could this actually work? Can we actually have a republic, a large republic, and can we actually make it work the way it was supposed to? With Lincoln, obviously, it was the crisis of the Civil War. Is the country going to fall apart, or can we keep it together somehow? And then, of course, with FDR, it was the back-to-back Great Depression, World War II crisis that he led us through. So generally, those three are. Sorry, I know you want me up, Marie, but I got to move around. Those three are normally rated one, 2, and 3. Now, Washington was lucky in some respects. Most of the people that were opposed to the Constitution didn't enter government at the national level. They all went back and played part in state government, but the people that were elected to Congress, and of course Mr. Washington himself, and the people he was able to appoint were all Federalists. Federalists were those that supported the Constitution. So-called anti-Federalists were those that opposed. Washington had a cabinet. The Constitution does not call for a cabinet. It says the president may, from time to time, consult the leaders of his executive divisions in making policy. Well, the Washington cabinet consisted of 3 people. Consisted of Alexander Hamilton, who was an economic genius, to be the Secretary of the Treasury. Thomas Jefferson, who had more experience. He'd just come back from France, where he had been the American ambassador to France as the Secretary of State. And Lord help us. The guy that had been his artillery commander during the Revolution weighed in at 350 pounds, which was larger than the entire American army, I think, as Secretary of War. And then as Attorney General, not a cabinet position, Edmund Randolph of Virginia. It'll come to me. Huh? No, Knox, thank you. Knox was a bookseller, and when he wasn't selling books, he was in the back of his store reading everything he could read about military theory, and he proved to be a remarkable artillery commander. Secretary of War, we don't have a national army. We have a 3-ship navy. He's not terribly busy in terms of what he does. But Washington, unfortunately, in his 2 most important cabinet members, found 2 people who couldn't get along with each other. Jefferson and Hamilton had remarkably different visions for what America was going to be. Hamilton believed that America needed to tie their strings to the British Navy. Our best buddies were the English. They were our number 1 trading partner. What we needed to do was to work on creating business as we would see it today. Jefferson believed that the future of America was a land of small farmers. He wanted a republic of virtue, he called it. All of this land that we had, west of the Appalachians, east of the Mississippi, he wanted that all developed with small farmers and therefore limited power in the hands of the federal government and greater power in the hands of the state government. And these 2 went at each other pretty hard. Eventually, both retired shortly after Washington's reelection. And Washington, I think, grew frustrated, tried to ride herd on all these people. And the truth is, much as if you come to my house, you'll see a huge picture of Mr. Jefferson on the wall. I admit that despite my heroes all have clay feet, and he certainly does, but he's still one of my heroes. But the truth is, Hamilton ended up being right, and Washington ended up being wrong. Jefferson ended up being wrong. We weren't going to be a land only of small farmers. We were going to be a commercial powerhouse. The presence, the likelihood was there. What Washington accomplished domestically was to keep these 2 guys in line and deal with a number of small crises. For example, one of the things that the government passed was a tax on whiskey. Now, corn whiskey is the number 1 alcoholic drink of the American frontier. And the reason for that is you can grow an awful lot of corn in the American frontier, but you can't transport it anywhere. The problem is you can't get the corn grown in the Ohio River Valley back over the Appalachians to get it to market. What you could do was to distill it into corn liquor, and you can put lots of corn liquor on the back of a donkey and carry it back over, and it becomes a medium of exchange on the frontier. Well, Hamilton had argued that there ought to be a tax on corn whiskey, and it led to one of the first battles between the American establishment, what we call Tidewater in Virginia, and the interior. People in the interior felt like they weren't getting a fair shake. And so there is this so-called whiskey rebellion in western Pennsylvania. Washington Washington becomes the only American president to actually lead an army in battle. He puts together an army. He doesn't go all the way with them. Hamilton does. Hamilton wants to hang everybody that fought against his tax. Washington ultimately pardoned everybody, but Washington does. He does ride his horse out into battle. Uh, the real problems, however, for the Washington administration had to do with what was going on in Europe. The French Revolution broke out right about the time that the United States of America began. 1787, Bastille Day. We just passed Bastille Day. The 14th of July is the French National Day. People stormed the Bastille where they thought there were hundreds of thousands of political prisoners locked up. There were 7, and they were all legally locked up. They'd all committed some kind of crime for which they were duly incarcerated. But that began the French Revolution. And the French Revolution ultimately will become a battle between the royalists who want to keep the Bourbon monarchy on the throne and the rebels. And of course, the problem for Mr. Washington is we got a permanent treaty with the French in 1777. The French and the Americans had made a perpetual treaty of friendship. And they're the reason we got our independence, folks. Make no doubt about it. They provided most of the material we needed. They ultimately provided an army of 5,600 men. But more than the point, they provided a fleet that bottled the British up at Yorktown and allowed America to win. So when the war breaks out, and after they lop off Louis XVI head in 1781, the war expands and everybody's involved, including the British. So here you have Alexander Hamilton's people fighting Thomas Jefferson's people. And the question was, what would we do? I mean, these people won our independence for us. Don't we have an obligation to go to war on the side of the French against the British? That's difficult. Washington handles it with great dignity. He ultimately establishes the Neutrality Proclamation. You know, we're not ready to fight. I'm sorry, it wouldn't make any difference for us to put an army in the field. Obviously, if we're going to put the army in the field, the people we ought to fight against are the English, because they got Canada. We can't get it anything the French have, but we can get it some the English have. If we're going to attack, let's attack those people. But Washington doesn't want to attack anybody, and so neutrality comes. The infighting goes on, but what Washington does is establish the way America is to operate. Washington understood that the U.S. Senate was his advisory committee. Now, that's the way the Virginia House of Burgesses was. The upper house of the Virginia House of Burgesses was appointed by the royal governor. And when they met, he met with them, went in, sat down, and talked to them. Well, the first time an issue came up that Washington wanted the advice and consent of the Senate, he went in and sat down and said, "Gentlemen, I got some things we need to talk about." And it wasn't pleasant. The senators kept looking at each other and kept thinking to themselves, when is this guy going away? And Washington didn't go away. And eventually he realized they were not going to be his advisory committee. They were going to be their own governmental body. He walked out, never went back. And in fact, from Thomas Jefferson to Woodrow Wilson, no American president ever addressed Congress. It was just something that didn't happen. Wilson corrected that, and we'll get to that sometime later. So, all in all, what Washington did was to establish a government that worked. Now, everybody, he wanted to quit after 4 years. You know, the Constitution doesn't speak about term, it says term of office is 4 years, but it doesn't mention reelection, doesn't mention how often you run, doesn't mention a lot of things that have come into existence since. Washington actually had written a farewell address. He got with Madison, had it all written, and Jefferson and Hamilton, even though they don't like each other, go to Washington and say, "You can't quit. You got to stay on for 4 more years at least, so this gets a chance to work." And Washington agrees. Um, there is in his second term, the whole thing that he was concerned about. We had all kinds of issues with the British. We had impressment issues where the British were stopping American ships. And if they found British citizens sailing on American ships, they did what was called impressment. They used the theory, once an Englishman, always an Englishman. We need you in our Navy, not their Navy. And so they simply pulled them off. There were issues on the American frontier. The Treaty of Paris, the British had agreed to certain boundaries, but then they kept occupying forts in the boundary that was American. And so what Washington did was he convinced America's first Chief Justice, John Jay, to go to England and negotiate all this out. Well, Jay's treaty was a pretty big flop. Jay didn't get anything out of the English, and in fact, most people felt like he gave something up. When the treaty was revealed, America went up in arms. Jay said that he could have ridden from Boston to Washington, to New York at night by the light of his burning effigies. The problem is people went after Washington. Exactly what Washington didn't want. For the first time, he's criticized in the newspapers that he messed up. And for somebody like Washington, with the sense that I need to protect my reputation, that was unfathomable. So in 1800, 1796, when the election rolls around, there's an attempt to recruit Washington again, and basically he says, "Ain't no way he's going back. He's had enough. 2 terms was enough. He's going back to Mount Vernon." Well, by this point in time, American political parties have come into existence. If you read the Federalist Paper number 10, Madison has this wonderful explanation of how political parties would never happen in America. But there was a battle between the Federalists, as they were referred to. Now they're not parties in our sense of the term. They're just political groupings. The Federalists were those who believed in what Hamilton was preaching. And then the so-called Jeffersonian Republicans were those who followed Jefferson's lead. And so what we have, Washington was elected unanimously both times. But what we have is the first contested election in American history. The way everything reads is that each state has a certain number of electoral votes. And the person who gets the most electoral votes is the president. The person who gets the second most electoral votes is the vice president. And so the result is, in 1796, John Adams, leader of the Federalists, is elected president, and Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the opposition, is elected vice president. And to say that Jefferson spent very little time at the Capitol is an understatement. He spent he spent almost all this time at Monticello, uh, showing up only when he had to. The big issue for Adams, though, was an undeclared naval war with the French. The French got upset with Jay's treaty. They said, "Wait a minute, you're our allies. We've got this treaty, and you need to honor that. You don't need to be sending your people to England." The French were afraid that we'd make a treaty with the English and turn on the French. And so there is an undeclared naval war. We never declare war on each other, but there's all kinds of stopping people on the high seas, inflicting all kinds of punishment. Um, One of there's the War of Jenkins' Ear, which had come earlier. Uh, some guy walks into Parliament and says the French just stopped me and they cut off my ear and said we do the same thing for the king if he were here. Uh, so it's that kind of stuff that's happening in Adams' administration. There is an attempt um, on the part of Mr. Adams to ease the tension. He sends a three-person committee headed up by John Marshall, who will be the great Chief Justice, first Chief Justice, first great Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and two others to negotiate an end to it. Let's get rid of this treaty. Let's don't just not follow it. Let's end it formally once and for all. And so Marshall and his two compatriots go to the French court and ask for an end to the Treaty of Perpetual Friendship. Now, the guy doing the negotiation for the French is Talleyrand. I loved when I taught European history, talk about Talleyrand. You know, there's some people in European history. Bismarck, love Talleyrand, love Cavour. You know, there's some strange people. But Talleyrand, he won't meet with the three Americans. He sends three people over to deal with it. And they said, okay, if you want to talk to Monsieur Talleyrand, here's what you have to do. You have to give him a bribe of $250,000. And you have to pay us, the French, another astounding amount of money. Well, the Americans, that's not uncommon European diplomacy, but that's uncommon American diplomacy. And the Americans walk out mad. Marshall writes all this up, and it comes that wonderful phrase, millions for defense, but not one penny for tribute. Uh, and it fires the Americans up. American press goes crazy that over this. We want an army. We want to go to battle with the French. How are we going to go to battle with the French? Nobody bothered to think about that. So we raise an army, and then the question is, who's going to lead the army? George Washington. Is it Mount Vernon? We'll go ask him to take charge of our army. Well, Washington reluctantly says yes, but only if Alexander Hamilton is his second in command and would actually lead the army in battle. And Adams and Hamilton hated each other. So that's not going to happen. Eventually, Adams will send back another group. By now, the government has changed. Napoleon Bonaparte is in charge. Bonaparte has big ideas. Bonaparte says, we don't want to deal with the Americans. Just get rid of the problem. And so eventually, Convention of 1800, Adams gets rid of our treaty with the French. The The problem, of course, with all of this is that the newspapers go crazy. And there are lots and lots of Jeffersonian Republican newspapers that criticize the government. And so Adams proposes and Congress passes what were called the Alien Acts and the Sedition Law. Now, the three Alien Acts, one says we can tell people they can't come to our country. Number two says if we don't like the people that are here, we can send them back, and in time of war, we can lock them up in jail and then send them back when the war is over with. Folks, that's the law Mr. Trump's using. In case you wondered, it was a law passed in 1798. I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying. It was passed in 1798. It was never repealed, and so it's still on the books that the president has the right, or the country has the right, I don't know if the president does, that if there are aliens that are not citizens of the United States, and we don't think that they are here for the best reasons, we have the right to let them go. Now, unfortunately, the sedition law, which seems to me clearly a violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution, said that you couldn't criticize the government or the governmental agents or the government's policies. Well, again, no Federalist editor was ever hauled in under the sedition law, but an awful lot of Republican editors were. My favorite was an editor named Matthew Lyon from Vermont, and he was also elected to the House of Representatives. And he gets mad at debate in Congress and walks down the aisle and spits in the guy's face. I just think that's class. It's just exactly what we want. Tell us how you really feel, Mr. Lyon. And so I think, I've forgotten 10 or 12 were locked up. But Adams was a funny character. He was maybe one of the foremost authorities on governmental policies. But he was stiff, he was reserved, he believed in his own importance more than anything else. Well, when the election of 1800 rolls around, obviously Adams wants to be reelected. The Jeffersonians push Mr. Jefferson. He wanted Madison. I'm sorry. Let's see if I can sit up here. He wanted Madison to run against Adams, but Madison didn't want to. He said, come on, you're Jefferson. Everybody knows you. Not everybody. You wrote the Declaration. You need to be the candidate. But everybody wanted to be certain. Remember, every member of the Electoral College cast 2 votes. And so what you got to make certain is that if this is going to work, you got to have 2 candidates that every one of the electors will vote for both of them. Because if one doesn't, then you could have the same kind of stupidity you had in 1796 when you get people of different parties occupying the top 2 places on the chart. So they work out a deal with Aaron Burr, one of the maybe one of the slimiest people in American history. Burr hated Hamilton, obviously. Eventually, he's going to shoot Hamilton. He doesn't like Adams. He agrees to deliver every New York vote, one for Jefferson, one for him, if the Jeffersonians will assure him that every southern state will vote for Jefferson and Burr. And that's exactly what happens. When the electoral vote is counted, Jefferson and Burr have the same number of electoral votes. And the Constitution doesn't say because Thomas Jefferson is Thomas Jefferson, he ought to be president, and Aaron Burr ought to be vice president. Burr has just as much claim to the presidency as Jefferson does. Well, what the Constitution says is, goes to the House of Representatives. They vote by state, not by individual representatives. And whoever gets the majority of the states will be the president. The other will be the vice president. Folks, this goes on for months because there are still more Federalists in the House of Representatives than there are Jeffersonian Republicans. And they don't want either of these guys. And the question is, what happens if neither of them gets a majority? What's going to occur? Finally, bless his heart, Hamilton, who doesn't like Jefferson, hates Burr more. And so he goes to all the Federalists and says, look, they're both scum, but Jefferson is less scum than Burr. And when that happens, Jefferson gets to be elected President of the United States only shortly before Inauguration Day. You know, we're accustomed to the two-term tradition. Now it's the law, but throughout most of American history, it was just a tradition. Washington only served 2 terms. And Jefferson, at the end of his second term, said that because Washington only served 2 terms, he didn't think anybody should serve more than 2 terms. So the 2-term tradition basically says anybody who can win election twice is secured 8 years in office. Do you realize that only twice in American history have we had back-to-back-to-back 2-term presidents? We so much think about that, but it's only happened twice. And this is the first time. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, all will serve 8 years. The only other time it happens, George W. Bush, Clinton, and Obama. All those presidents in between, none of them, never did we have a 3 consecutive elections where the president served 8 years in office. Now Jefferson, interesting cat. If you ever want to talk about Sally Hemings, I will do so. I'm pretty good on Sally Hemings, but we went to Monticello. Sandy and her mother and I went, and then Sandy's sister and her son and I went. They've buried the hatchet. They don't try to hide Sally Hemings anymore. Yes, Jefferson produced 5 children by one of his slaves. Not only was she one of his slaves, she was his wife, half-sister, which I always found amazingly worthless. None of my business, but I still have Mr. Jefferson's picture on the wall. As I say, my heroes all have clay feet, and Jefferson is one of those that does. He served 8 years. The first 4 years were one of the most successful terms in American history, and it was for one good reason: the Louisiana Purchase. The French had badgered the Spanish into giving them control of all of the Spanish lands west of the Mississippi. Nobody knew exactly where all that was, but Napoleon had this dream. He was going to reestablish the French Empire, and he was going to do it by making the Sugar Islands. And remember, we talked about this last time. The number one, the most valuable export commodity was sugar. When the British had their 5 enumerated goods, it was sugar, tobacco, rice, indigo, and naval stores. But sugar was more important than all of the others combined. And so what Napoleon wanted to do was to rebuild the French sugar islands in the Caribbean. and he wanted to use the land west of the Mississippi as a granary. He wanted to grow grain and foodstuffs there that he could bring into his Caribbean islands so they don't have to waste time, energy, and land on growing foodstuffs. That was his goal. Well, unfortunately for Napoleon, there was a major uprising in one of the French islands, led by a remarkably intelligent slave by the name of Toussaint Louverture. And Toussaint Louverture was educated enough that he read military manuals and he figured out how to fight a guerrilla warfare. And so the French, Napoleon kept sending armies over. The armies could beat the locals in battle, but the locals just vanished into the hillside and then came back out again. What the French couldn't beat was the mosquito. The French armies were devastated by malaria and by all kinds of diseases they weren't used to. When Napoleon's best general, his own brother-in-law, died of malaria, Napoleon decided maybe this wasn't such a good idea. I think his comment was, damn sugar, damn coffee, and damn colonies. Plus, he's ready to go back to war with the English. They'd been at peace. The only time Europe is at peace from 1791 until 1815 was 14 months. And he's now decided they're going back to war. He wants to attack England. And so what he needs is not sugar, he needs cash. And so suddenly he approaches the American ambassadors and says, are you interested? Now, the truth is, what the Americans were interested in was not Louisiana. They wanted New Orleans. They wanted Florida. They wanted, nobody had any clue what the Spanish had given Napoleon. Everybody in America assumed that they had given him New Orleans and Florida. Well, New Orleans, it's the end of the Mississippi. If we're going to develop the farmland of the Midwest, the only way to get our crops to market is to float down the Mississippi to New Orleans, sell them there, what was called the right of deposit, where we could deposit them in a warehouse until there were ships ready to carry them off. Well, obviously, if we don't control New Orleans, we don't have that guaranteed right. And the Spanish weren't going to give it to us. So now the thought was, well, if they've given New Orleans to the French, and we can buy New Orleans and whatever part of Florida they will sell us, then we're good. We'll control the mouth of the Mississippi. Problem, of course, is French don't own Florida. They own New Orleans and a lot of territory to the west. Who knows how much? But they control a lot of territory. And so eventually a deal is struck for $15 million. America gets New Orleans and what becomes known as the Louisiana Territory. Now, we don't know what we got. Jefferson, one of the best things he did was he got his personal secretary, a guy by the name of Meriwether Lewis, and a good friend from Charlottesville by the name of William Clark, whose brother George Rogers Clark had been one of the heroes of the American Revolution. And he sent them on what was called the Corps of Discovery. They made their way up the Missouri. The hope was they could make friends, if you like, with the native tribes. But the hope was that there was actually a way through the Rocky Mountains. If we could find a way through the Rocky Mountains, everything would be good. The Corps of Discovery, it's remarkable what they accomplished. And they did it with losing, I think, only one man. They made friends with the Indians. They were gone 3 years. They found ways through the Rockies, not obviously a water route. They explored the Snake River and the Columbia, and eventually made it back. It was kind of interesting. Meriwether Lewis was killed walking up the Natchez Trace. There's a state park in Tennessee where he was under mysterious circumstances, where he was murdered. William Clark went on to be the governor of the territory. But as they're doing that, a guy by the name of Zebulon Pike was making his explorations up the Mississippi all the way into modern day Minnesota. And then, of course, along the territory that was questionable, was it Spanish or was it American, discovered Pike's Peak, which bears his name to this day. The accomplishments of Jefferson's first 4 years probably did more to inspire nationalism than anything. There was concern that people west of the Appalachians, if they don't get some kind of help from the government, they're going to form their own nation. I mean, they let them form their own and let them go out and negotiate with people. So they've got the right of deposit in New Orleans. Now suddenly that's all taken care of, and nationalism comes strongly. When Jefferson then runs for re-election in 1804, he carries every state but two. Only 14 electoral votes against him. Mr. Burr gets in all kind of trouble. Eventually, he will kill Hamilton in a duel. He will be tried for treason. Treason's interesting. It's the only crime, I think, defined in the Constitution. What treason is defined as levying war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to the enemy in time of war. But it is only punish. You can only convict somebody on the witness of two people to the same overt act, or by open confession in court. Well, Burr was smart. He never explored his interests, his desires, whatever they were, to anybody, and consequently, even though Jefferson wanted him convicted so bad, it was he couldn't stand it. And the trial was in Richmond, and the Chief Justice, John Marshall, presided the trial. Jefferson and John Marshall are first cousins, and they detested each other. And Marshall made certain, Marshall, who took all kind of liberties with the law, not in that case. Nope, you don't have two people to the same overt action, you can't be convicted. The second time around for Mr. Jefferson is not so positive. In 1806, a ship called the Chesapeake that had been built in Norfolk, Newport News area was on what I guess we would call a shakedown cruise. Send it out and make sure it's going to, before you put arms on it, make sure it's going to float. And it's in the Atlantic, and fly an American flag, clearly an American naval vessel, and it gets stopped by a British ship. They demand the right to come on board and see if there are British sailors that they can then impress. Well, they've done this to a lot of merchant vessels, but they've never stopped a ship of the U.S. Navy, and the commander refuses to stop. Well, the British fire broadside. Chesapeake is much wounded. Overcomes a boarding party. They haul off 4 or 5 screaming people, no, 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 we're American. And the Chesapeake limps back into harbor. The American flag's been fired on. You don't do that. You can't turn the other cheek. Jefferson, who's probably more poorly prepared to meet to lead a nation in war than anybody else who's president of the United States, now has to decide what to do. You know, he is he going to declare war? Is he going to build ships? Is he going to raise an army? All of which, because he's a penny pincher. Jefferson's a penny pincher for everything except his own expenses. He will die $20,000 in debt. He loses Monticello, loses all his slaves, but he's big on the nations watching its expenditures carefully. And so what he does is he announces an embargo. No American ships will leave American harbors for anywhere, nor will we allow any other ships to come in. Well, I guess the thought is this is going to, we're England's number one trading partner. Maybe this will bring them around. But the problem is this not only hurts the shippers of New England, it hurts the small farmers. It hurts Jefferson's people. They can't export their crops. The embargo is probably one of the biggest fiascos, if you like. But all it does is keep us out of war for a while longer. I think, well, I don't know that Jefferson ever commented on the success or failure. But his successor, Madison, although he opened it up slightly, he kept the embargo going. We tried economic warfare. You know, what the Constitution says is that you can't put export taxes on products. We can tax imports. We can't tax exports. Well, if you can't tax exports, can you say we're not going to have any exports? I mean, that's slightly questionable, but Jefferson gets away with it. 1808, Madison is elected as his successor. Montpelier and Monticello are about 30 miles apart. In fact, when Jefferson builds the University of Virginia in 1819, he, Madison, and Monroe are all three members of the Board of Visitors. They were all good buddies. They were all cut from the same piece of cloth. Madison may be as poorly prepared to lead a nation into war as Jefferson was, but eventually the so-called war hawks, those people that showed up for the first time in the U.S. Congress in 1812, were a different breed from the ones that had preceded them. They were young. They were primarily from the West rather than the East. They felt like they had something to prove. It was their daddy's generation that had whipped the English in the Revolution. And I'm sure their daddy's generation went around and said, what are you all doing? And so the Warhawks now are not going to take this line down. And out of this will come eventually the War of 1812. War of 1812 will dominate Madison's term. Arguably very poorly fought on our side. As the thing that saves us is England is fighting Napoleon, and therefore their best armies and best commanders are in Europe, and we're able to hang on. You all know the story. They invade D.C. They burn the White House. They burn, in fact, every public building. They leave the buildings of the private citizens alone. They when the war in Europe ends, they actually have a three-pronged invasion of the Americans planned. One is to come down Lake Champlain, and they lose to the Americans at the Battle of Plattsburgh. So that ends that. They then are going to invade Washington and Baltimore. And again, we know the story of their attempt to take Baltimore. Unsuccessful. Francis Scott Key observed all of this and wrote what becomes the national anthem. And then the third is to come attack New Orleans. And that's where Andrew Jackson uh, appears on the political scene for the first time. We get to him next week. We're not going to get to Jackson this week. But Andy J wins. But the funny thing is that this war is so hated by the people in New England that they actually have a convention in which they are thinking about seceding from America and throwing in with the English. The Hartford Convention. Now, it doesn't propose secession, but it does propose a number of changes to the Constitution that would weaken the power of the federal government. The Federalists believing that they're the people, even though they're in the minority, they're the people that ought to be running the country. And these hayseed Southerners need to go back home and raise tobacco. But timing is wonderful. You know, we're so used to immediate communication. You know, you pick up the cell phone, call somebody right away. You get an answer, or you don't get an answer. You can leave a nasty message, whatever the issue is, or you can fax something to somebody. Or now we got AI. I got no idea what AI is, so I'm not gonna explore that. But timing is difficult in the the era before the 20th century, if you like. What happens is the people at Hartford, well, eventually Napoleon is defeated. The great powers in Europe are all at Vienna. They're all making one of the most important pacts in world history. The Americans and the British meet at Ghent in Belgium. Now, all the good British negotiators are in Vienna, so they send second-rate politicians to negotiate with the Americans. We send Albert Gallatin, Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Clay, one of the chief war hawks, and John Quincy Adams. And the British are so certain now that they've got all of these European armies that they're going to just donkey tromp us, that they make all kinds of demands. They demand that we surrender to them everything north of the Ohio River and make it into an Indian nation. Well, not to be outdone, Clay says, nah, we're not giving you that. What we want is for you to surrender Canada to us. Well, we had won a battle. I mean, we've lost everything. But Clay's not going to be put down to too much, at least. The result is that what the British expect is a great victory. When they lose at Plattsburgh and they lose at Baltimore, suddenly it becomes apparent that the best thing we can do is get the war over with. I mean, let's end once and for all. And the Treaty of Ghent that is negotiated, I think it's signed December the 24th. Um, yeah, on December the 24th, says nothing. Status quo ante bellum. If you took it from us, give it back. If we took it from you, give it back. I mean, we were upset about impressment. We were upset about stealing our ships. We were upset about not getting out of our land in the West. We had all kinds of things we wanted to go to war for. None of them are addressed at all. There are very few status quo peace treaties in world history that have worked. But the Treaty of Ghent does. And it works just because all the issues go away. We don't negotiate them away. But suddenly, with Napoleon beaten, the English have no reason to stop our ships. They have no reason to interfere with our trade. They do get out of our territory. It's all over with. And so here's the timing. I love this. People in Hartford have demanded changes to the Constitution to give the Federalists rights. They show up in late December of 1814. Okay? And they get a good hearing. You know, everybody at the time thought we were getting beat. And so people actually paid attention to these yay-hos. Then the Battle of New Orleans, when America loses, I think, something like 200 people, and the British lose 2,000. It makes Jackson. It is Jackson's reputation. But that then arrives in Washington and kind of laughs the Hartford people out of office. And then the word comes, because Battle of New Orleans is in January. Then the treaty that had been negotiated on December the 24th, it arrives. And what it looks like is Jackson kicked their rear ends, and they came up and made a treaty with us. And again, Battle of New Orleans wouldn't have happened if we'd had the kind of communication we have today. Madison is one of the few presidents in American history who leaves office more popular than he came in. I mean, he hadn't done anything particularly astounding, but suddenly we're at peace. We're at peace, and everything we wanted, we got. His successor, James Monroe, and if you know where to stand at Monroe's house, you can see the top of Monticello. They were that close. There's a piece of the University of Virginia called Monroe Hill that was built on land that Monroe owned. Monroe is probably of the, say this right, of the four early Virginia presidents, he's probably the weakest. But he oversees what's called the era of good feelings, 1816, 1824. And they're good feelings because we didn't lose the war. Not because we won it, but because we didn't lose it. Madison even takes a goodwill tour through New England. Same people that wanted to clip his wings. And he's able to go up and is able to get all kinds of hurrahs. There are a number of things that happen during Monroe's term that will be significant. For one thing, it is an era when we make a number of treaties that are going to help define America. One is the Rush-Bagot Agreement, which defines what's going to happen on the Great Lakes. Great Lakes are always going to be our dividing line with the Canadians. If they build a Navy there and we build a Navy there, we're going to be fighting forever. And so the Rush-Bagot Agreement defines what can and cannot happen. The Treaty of 1818 defines the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. For the first time, it runs it on the 46th parallel from the Lake of the Woods to the Rocky Mountains. It doesn't deal with anything to the west of the Rockies. And because it starts at the Lake of the Woods, when we get to Webster Ashburton, that becomes an important thing for America. Then in 1819, the Adams-Onís Treaty is the treaty by which we gain Florida from the Spanish and define the southern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. It's not a straight line like the northern boundary is. It goes up river valleys. But we know what we've got. And then, of course, in 1823, Mr. Monroe, in a Christmas message to his cabinet, issues what's called the Monroe Doctrine, one of the most important pieces of diplomacy in American history, in which he says, stay out of our hemisphere. And when he implies, doesn't say it, we'll stay out of yours. And that defines 19th century American diplomacy. From then to the Spanish-American War, we leave England alone, Europe alone. Europe leaves us alone for the most part. The other things that happened, the second Bank of the United States, first Bank of the United States had been Hamilton's idea. Jefferson opposed it. It had created some kind of financial consistency. It was chartered for 20 years. Unfortunately, it goes out of existence in 1812. And we almost go under in the war because we don't have anything controlling the currency. And so even those Jeffersonians that opposed the first Bank of the United States now become excited about the second Bank of the United States. Come back next week and we'll find out what happens to that. And then the third positive of the era of good feelings is that we, for the first time in American history, adopt a tariff policy. Now, the South didn't like tariffs. They were in the position where they raised agricultural products, and there was nobody who could bring agricultural products in and compete with the ones we raised at home. So a tariff doesn't help them, but it raised the cost of every manufactured good that they had to buy. They in essence, were selling on an unprotected market and buying on a protected one. And yet, feelings are so good, most of the Southerners pony on up and vote for the tariff of 1816. So good feelings. We're feeling good about ourselves. But there's two issues that will end up. And when Monroe runs for re-election in 1820, there's only one candidate. The Federalists are dead. They run their last candidate in 1816. There we are, a one political party nation. And therefore, theoretically, Monroe should have been unanimously elected as Washington was. But there was one dude that decided he wasn't worth being like George Washington. And so he cast his vote for John Quincy Adams to keep Monroe from being a unanimously elected president. But there are two things that Monroe gets to oversee all the good things. He also has to oversee some of the bad things. In 1819, the first economic panic in American history descends on the U.S. People had overbought land, overbought equipment because of the war, and they thought they could make up, anything I raise can be sold. And the thought process was, we'll just keep growing. Well, problem is, once the war was over with, there wasn't the same demand for American products, even at home. And so a lot of people found themselves overextended on debt in terms of what they had borrowed against what they could make up. Panic of 1819 will run on for a number of other years. And so again, we'll pick that up next week. But the thing that probably, other than Monroe's doctrine, the thing that may most settle Monroe's reputation is the question of Missouri statehood. In 1820, Missouri, and remember the process is you become a disorganized territory till you get to 5,000 people. When you get to 5,000 people, you can become an organized territory where you can have a territorial legislature. And again, you don't have, you can tax, you can pass laws, the government still runs it, but you have certain rights. And then when you had 60,000 people, you can become a state. You draft a constitution, you elect two senators and a representative. You send them with the Constitution off to Washington, and which is where the Capitol is now, and the Congress decides whether you're allowed to be a state or not. Now, that's the process. That's been the process forever. Vermont had been admitted to the Union. Uh, Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, Louisiana. Nobody had paid much attention to anything. You know, states came up, we admit them. Missouri's different. Missouri is the first state west of the Mississippi. It's the first state to be carved out of the Louisiana Purchase territory. It is therefore looked upon as what Missouri does is everything going to happen the same way in the Louisiana Territory. Now, Missouri had drafted a constitution which allowed for the existence of slavery. So that then becomes the question. Do we want slavery in the states that are going to be created west of the Mississippi in the Louisiana Purchase? There would have been no question. I mean, nobody questioned slavery or not slavery. And Tennessee was a slave state. Kentucky was a slave state. Ohio and Vermont were free states. You know, the balance was even. But suddenly now that becomes an issue. A representative from New York by the name of James Talmadge introduces a resolution that says Missouri can only be admitted if they adopt policies for gradual admission of slavery and admit no more new slaves to Missouri. There's a red flag. Thomas Jefferson, 77 years old in Monticello, called it a fire bell in the night. Fire bell in the night that would wake people from the sleep because of what was happening. Now, James Talmadge is not an abolitionist. He don't care, as far as I know. I don't think he ever expressed himself about slavery or about black people. What James Talmadge wanted was for that land in Louisiana Purchase to be always available to white farmers. And he knew that if white farmers on small parcels of land had to deal with huge plantations. Now, again, most of Louisiana wouldn't open itself to slavery anyway, but nobody really knew that. And what Talmadge wants is to make certain that if this is setting the tone for what's coming, we need to make certain that we are protecting the right of the small farmer. And so now suddenly, what had happened without any consideration? You know, they met the requirement. They got 60,000 people. They got a constitution. We're going to let them in. Not anymore. And so Missouri could have been the first big challenge to what was not yet. You know, we think of the United States. Most people didn't think of the United States, even in 1820. In fact, they say that the first time the United States appears in newspapers is after the Civil War. Up until then, you go back in time, people would say, Hey, I'm a Kentuckian. I'm a Tennessean. I'm an Ohioan. You know, we're still not quite at the point of seeing unity in what has become the United States. Is Missouri going to be the thing that's going to rock us? Is it going to be the shows that we're gonna fall apart over? Now, enter Henry Clay. Clay, whatever his faults, Henry Clay loved America. He was a um, he didn't want to see America go down. And so he introduces the first of three great compromises. Three compromises that will keep the Union together until eventually the election of Mr. Lincoln will end it in 1861. His proposal is that Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts forever, but now had spun off as an independent territory, and it was ready for admission. Let's take Maine in as a free state. Let Missouri come in as a slave state, and that would keep the balance. There would be 15 of each in the United States. But let's draw a line at 36 degrees, 30 minutes. And 36 degrees, 30 minutes is the southern boundary of Missouri. And no slave states north of 3630 can be carved out of the Louisiana Purchase territory. At the time, that seems reasonable. Now, the problem is the only territory south of that is what will become Arkansas, and eventually Oklahoma and Texas. But the truth was that the compromise seemed to work because people were convinced that most of Louisiana would be settled without any thought of the institution of slavery. But it's a fire bell in the night, folks. The slave issue is raised in a major way in 1820, and it won't go away. It'll be pushed down so that we will muddle on along. But those differences, those issues, will still remain in 1861. So that's the first five. I thank you all for being with us. I thank you for being with me. Next week, we'll get J.Q. Adams, chip off the old iceberg. Andrew Jackson, I love Jackson. He's probably got, if he knew what MAGA was, I think Andrew Jackson's followers would be big time MAGA. When Trump said I could shoot somebody in Times Square and not lose a single vote, Andrew Jackson could say the same thing. Van Buren, Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison, he only lasted a month. Sorry, we won't spend much time on Harrison. John Tyler, and one of my favorites, James K. Polk. I'll be next week. Thank you all for being here.